Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 3 October 2025. In a moment of inspiration, on Tuesday, 3 October 1854, 171 years ago today, Ferdinand Gregorovius conceived his multi-volume History of Rome in the Middle Ages. In his Roman journal, he wrote, quote, I propose to write the history of the city of Rome in the Middle Ages. For this work, it seems to me that I require a special gift, or better, a commission from Jupiter Capitolinus himself. I conceived the thought, struck by the view of the city as seen from the bridge leading to the island of St. Bartholomew. I must undertake something great, something that will lend a purpose to my life. Unquote. K.F. Morrison, the editor of an abridged edition of Gregorovius, described this inspiration such that, quote, he saw Rome as a point of intersection for the great forces whose conflicts had generated European civilization, unquote. I quoted both of these in my previous episode on Gregorovius, comparing it to Gibbon's moment of inspiration, although Gibbon conceived of his life work in the Roman Forum, not at the Ponte Fabricio. Not only did both Gibbon and Gregorovius experience their inspiration for their life work in Rome, both had more or less the same inspiration to write the history of Rome. But while Gibbon's project eventually expanded to encompass the entire empire, Gregorovius remained focused on the city of Rome itself. Despite remaining focused on the city of Rome, Gregorovius' project was as monumental as Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was 6 volumes in its original first edition. Gregorovius' History of the City of Rome in the Middle Ages was 8 volumes in its first edition. Last year, I produced an episode on Gregorovius in which I suggested that his history, which was focused on the city of Rome, could be called a mesohistory, in contradistinction to microhistory on the one hand and macrohistory on the other hand. Charles Joyner characterized microhistory as big questions in small places, and is familiar to us from popular works such as those of Carlo Ginzburg, and coming at it from a different angle, Emmanuel Leroy-Laduree's book Montéon, or An Occitan Village from 1294 to 1324, or Ronald Blythe's Aikenfield Portrait of an English Village, both of which can also be thought of as social history or historical sociology. Macrohistory, on the other hand, looks at history on the largest scales and sometimes takes the form of a focus on the longue durée, as in the Annales school, or world history, as well as big history. The Russian interest in world systems theory, such as we find in Andrei Koroteyev and his colleagues at the Big History and System Forecasting Center at the Russian Academy of Sciences, also, I think, belongs to macrohistory. Popular examples of macrohistory might include William MacNeill's many books, perhaps especially Plagues and Peoples, Jared's Diamond books, such as Guns, Germs, and Steel is the most famous, and other ones like Upheaval, and John Roberts' single-volume History of the World. However, it's not uncommon to find a micro and a macro history contrasted without any reference to any of these authors or schools of thought. It is, in a sense, a perennial idea that surfaces every so often. Siegfried Kracauer made a point of playing off microhistory against macrohistory. Paul Oscar Christeller, the editor of Krakauer's History, The Last Things Before the Last, wrote of Krakauer's thought, quote, the discrepancy between general and special history, or, as he calls it, macro and micro history, represents a serious dilemma. Krakauer seems to think that the results of special research are so complicated and so resistant to generalization that most of them must be ignored by the general historian, unquote. With microhistory focusing on small communities or villages, and macrohistory taking the whole of historical time as its scope, the middle ground between these two would be mesohistory. The history of a large and historically important city like Rome occupies this middle ground between microhistory and macrohistory, and this is why I called it Mesohistory last year. Since I suggested that Gregorovius' work constitutes mesohistory, I found the idea of mesohistory also in Daniel Little's book, New Contributions to the Philosophy of History. Little says, quote, "Doing history forces us to make choices about the scale of the history with which we are concerned," unquote. He makes the contrast between microhistory and macrohistory in this way, quote, "Histories limited in time and space can appropriately be called microhistory," unquote. And at the other end of the scale, some historians have, quote, "chosen a scale that encompasses virtually the whole of the globe over millennia of time," unquote. But with the quotation I made, I should say, as with the quotation I made from Christeller on Krakauer, Little sees a problem with the antithetical approaches of macrohistory and microhistory. Quote, "Microhistory leaves us with the question, how does this particular village shed light on anything larger? And macrohistory leaves us with the question, how do these grand assertions about causality really work out in the context of Canada or Sichuan? The first threatens to be so particular as to lose all interest, whereas the second threatens to be so general as to lose all empirical relevance to real historical processes," unquote. I think both microhistorians and macrohistorians would have good responses to Little's questions, since both have their appropriate scope of inquiry inspired by the questions they sought to answer. But I'm also sympathetic to Little pointing beyond the dialectic of micro and macro history to the possibility of a mesohistory. Quote, "There is a third choice available to the historian, however, that addresses both points. This is to choose a scale that encompasses enough time and space to be genuinely interesting and important, but not so much as to defy valid analysis. This level of scale might be regional, it might be national, as it might be supranational. The key point is that historians in this middle range are free to choose the scale of analysis that seems to permit the best level of conceptualization of history, given the evidence that is available and the social processes that appear to be at work. This level of analysis can be referred to as mesohistory, and it appears to offer an ideal mix of specificity and generality," unquote. He also characterizes mesohistory more briefly as, quote, "a middle way between grand theory and excessively particularistic narrative," unquote. I said I'm sympathetic to Little's account of mesohistory, but I think it also needs to be said that we're dealing with a continuum ranging from microhistory at one end of the continuum to macrohistory at the other end of the continuum, and all actual histories occupy some point along this continuum. Given this continuum, the polar ends of the continuum are ideals that are rarely realized in practice, meaning that most history is mesohistory, although any given example of mesohistory could tend toward the micro end of the scale or the macro end of the scale. Little suggests that mesohistory has more in common with macrohistory than with microhistory, and he formulates criteria of historical explanation based on his understanding of mesohistory tending toward larger historical structures. Of mesohistorical explanation, he says, quote, "The conception of large-scale historical change that is worth defending is what I will call conjunctural, contingent, meso-level explanation," unquote. And then Little goes on to describe each of these in turn. Quote, "Conjunctural, because at every point there are a range of independent factors present that are salient to the choices and outcomes which will take place, each of which has its own history of emergence, contingency, and reproduction," unquote. Note that Little's use of conjunctural takes over an important term from Fernand Braudel's tripartite division of scales of history into the history of the event, the history of the conjuncture, which endures for about a generation, and the longue durée, which endures for hundreds of years. For Braudel, then, conjunctural history is mesohistory, between the microhistory of the event and the macrohistory of the longue durée. Liddell partially takes over this meaning, but not entirely, since his conception of mesohistory tends toward larger historical structures and longer historical periods. Liddell continues with his mesohistorical criteria of historical explanation, quote, contingent, both because a given structural configuration still leaves room for strategic choice by actors, and because particular conjunctions of factors are not themselves historically determined, unquote. There's another tension here beyond the problems posed by the division between the apparent triviality of microhistory and the apparent inapplicability of macrohistory, and that is the tension between contingency and deterministic explanation. This isn't specific to Mesohistory or to Daniel Liddell's account of Mesohistory because it infects the whole of historical thought. We can explain an event. If we can explain an event, that event would seem to be deterministic, and that conflicts with our intuitions of historical contingency, as in the famous parable of how a kingdom was lost for want of a nail. However, if we allow for the contingency of historical events, we can't explain them. Or, in a stronger formulation, these events, or at least the mechanism behind the historical events, are not only incommensurable, but possibly also ineffable. Again, here, we can see that there's a continuum that reaches from the purely deterministic explanation, in which every detail is made explicit and every jot and tittle is accounted for, and the purely contingent account, which must be limited to pure description, or, if pushed further to ineffability, excludes even description. Liddell concludes with the definitive property of mesohistorical explanation, which is its non-trivial and readily applicable explanatory power, which we can see is a continuation of the tension between contingency and determinism. After the conjunctural and the contingent elements that he earlier mentioned comes the meso-level property of historical explanation. Quote, meso-level in that the most useful explanatory causal factors are those that fall at an intermediate level of generality and specificity, unquote. Again, I'm sympathetic to this and I agree that meso-level explanatory causal factors are more likely to fall within the parameters of human intuition and therefore are more likely to be accredited explanatory weight as compared to a pure examples of microhistory and macrohistory with their frightening shadows of triviality and inapplicability in the background of both of them. There is, in fact, a concealed anthropocentrism in this account of mesohistory, since what's in the middle of the scale of space and time is middle relative to the human experience of space and time. Also, as I implied earlier, Liddell skirts the problems of microhistory's triviality and macrohistory's inapplicability by substituting the problem of contingency versus determinism without resolving either of these problems. We don't need to solve these problems to do history. If, as I've argued, Gregorovius' history of the city of Rome constitutes mesohistory, then mesohistory is possible, even if the theoretical problems of philosophy of history remain unresolved. But even as the historian continues with his work, largely untroubled by what philosophers have to say about it, the philosopher of history also continues with his work. And there's a lot of work that could be done in better defining macro, meso, and micro history. For example, we could quantify the implicit continuum history that stretches from microhistory to macrohistory, and then divide this continuum into categories of historical inquiry broadly based on the defined scales of time. But in history, we're not only working with scales of time, but also with the scale of historical structures, or if you prefer, historical institutions. Just as we could write the microhistory of a village, we could also write a macrohistory of the same village if that village has endured through historical scales of time, like as long as Rome has endured and won through its endurance the title of Eternal City. So there are at least a couple of axes here, and these axes roughly correspond to the distinction that historians make between diachronic history, that is, endurance in time, and synchronic history, the scale of the institution with which we're concerned. The axes of diachronic history and synchronic history, together with the axes of microhistory and macrohistory, don't merely define a continuum, but they actually define a compass. And this compass, in turn, defines 4 quadrants with Mesohistory at the center of it all. In this way, Mesohistory is a non-Copernican conception that anchors us in something peculiarly human, which I earlier implied when I said that Little's Mesohistory was anthropocentric. A history of a city, like Gregorovius' A History of Rome, is centered on a human, all-too-human institution. I'm not suggesting that this anthropocentrism is a failure on the part of historians, but I am saying that this anthropocentrism needs to be made explicit. We need to anchor ourselves in space and time, even if our anchor is an anthropocentric anchor. But in anchoring our perspective in something like a city, even if it is the eternal city, we shouldn't fool ourselves that we've gotten outside human history and have achieved the rigor of an objective standard. Thanks for listening.